What's up, friends? So usually I don't do a separate review video outside of my reaction and commentary videos, but after watching the first two Rings of Power episodes on Friday, I had a lot of things to say in particular about the show so far, and so that's what this video is going to be. Just felt like it deserved its own separate video where I just discuss my feelings on the show so far, and so curious to see how you all are feeling about the show up to this point as well. And in the review, I'll be talking about some spoilers for the first two episodes, and so if you haven't seen them yet, just be aware that those are coming up. And of course, eventually there will still be a reaction highlight video of my watch through of the first season, so this isn't replacing that by any means. Just wanted to get my thoughts out there first. So without further ado, this is my review for the first two episodes of the Rings of Power. Well, now that my initial hype and excitement has kind of died down, now that I've actually gotten into the show, about 2 hours worth of it with these first two episodes, I am starting to feel a little bit more apprehensive or unsure about where the story is going and how the show is going to progress. First off, though, production value, the visuals and everything like that are incredible. I don't think there's any denying that, because they have certainly gone all out with making the world feel alive and beautiful. A lot of the aspects of the cinematography have been great, and so I think from a technical side, the show is definitely hitting on all cylinders there. But as I mentioned in the first episode, I think it was, during that can only take you so far if you don't have a really strong story and all these good narrative aspects to back it up and to accentuate those good parts of the technical side. And I feel like even just with 2 episodes here, it's starting to show some cracks that it may not be as solid as I was hoping for, which is so disappointing if it does end up being like that. Obviously, just the first 2 episodes, I'm not gonna judge it completely based off that, just give my initial thoughts about how I feel about things. But I feel like outside of Morfydd Clark as Galadriel, there hasn't been really anybody, as far as characters go, that's really wowed me or that I've latched onto pretty quickly. Whereas I feel like with Lord of the Rings, and even The Hobbit in particular, for some of its faults, obviously not perfect, but I feel like with both of those, I very quickly got attached to the characters, and they felt so alive and with so much personality about them. And I feel like part of that, the reason that I felt more attached to those characters, goes back to the reason I mentioned just a second ago during the credits, that they're throwing way too many characters at us way too quick. Whereas with the beginning of Lord of the Rings, they went through this quick recap of the lore and how we've gotten to that certain point in the world and showed us all these different characters. But then we just focus on the hobbits pretty much exclusively until we see Gandalf kind of go off by himself and meet Saruman and all of that. From memory, I mean, I've watched the movies a lot, but I don't have them perfectly memorized. And so you get really attached to those characters, and then they gradually bring in person by person until we've met the whole fellowship. And so it's much more easy to introduce us to new characters when we already have a good basis to go off of. Whereas here, even Galadriel, I'm not even sure if she is the overall main character at this point. With the amount of screen time they've given her, it feels like she's getting just as much, if not less, in this episode than other characters. And so there's really nobody that I'm super attached to right now. Even Galadriel, for all the great acting Morfydd Clark has done so far, besides just knowing who she is in the future, doesn't seem to have too much to go off of with the material here. And admittedly, we've gotten some great set pieces and some great visuals with these characters in them, but they just haven't given me any reason to feel like they are going to be very memorable or like they're going to be characters I'm going to love watching going forward. And I guess dealing with more character stuff in that aspect outside of Morfydd Clark, I don't know if any of the performances have been necessarily home runs either. I obviously mentioned the 2 Harfoot kids performances aren't my favorite. Feels like it's a little too silly at times, or a little out of place for the world that Lord of the Rings is. Not that Lord of the Rings has been without humor or funny moments or anything like that, or quirky characters. The way they've just written some of the moments feels less like, hey, these are just funny personalities, and more like, hey, look at these quirky lines we threw in, or something like that. I don't even know if that makes sense. Kind of hard to describe, but there are definitely some interesting prospects that we could get to with some of the characters, and so hopefully it picks up a little bit and the season finishes strong. But if we keep switching locations and characters as much as we have been and introducing even more new characters, I don't feel like I'm ever going to get too attached. Even in something like Game of Thrones, another fantasy property, when we jumped around to different characters and whatnot, I feel like even then they didn't pack too much into certain episodes, especially early on. We kind of had our main group that we would follow, and then every so often we'd see these other characters, and then in an episode we'd maybe follow 3 groups or whatever, and then another episode we'd follow 3 different groups or something like that. And so out of all the aspects of the show so far, I feel like that's the weakest aspect, which it bums me out that I have to talk about things that I don't necessarily love about the show this early on. But I also feel like, based off where the story is at this point, they gave us too much action too early, because I thought when we got the battle sequence, then got the troll in like the first 15-20 minutes or something like that, and they were scaling a mountain as well, I thought, man, this series is going to be non-stop adrenaline, or just at least filled with a lot of stuff like that. But then really the only other action sequence or tense moment I feel like we've gotten since then are the orc battle there in that episode when Bronwyn and her kid are fighting it, and then I forget the elf guy's name, but when he gets kind of pulled back in by what I assume is another orc. And beyond that, I don't feel like we've gotten very much. But compare that to Lord of the Rings. Obviously a TV show will be a little bit slower paced in getting to things, but in Lord of the Rings we have the incredible opening battle sequence, and then not long after that we get a chase with the ring wraiths and some action there. And so I feel like they needed to gradually introduce us to that stuff, or give us more frequently if they wanted to keep the excitement up. These are just some jumbled thoughts right now. Hopefully it's not too difficult to follow my thought process of where I feel these episodes are at. And I'm also very curious to see what everybody else is saying, because I feel like there could be a mixed reaction, or a lot of people could love it. Also, a lot of people could hate it, because people really love Lord of the Rings, and if you don't do something perfect in that world, I feel like you could face the wrath of a lot of people. But considering how much money they've devoted to this series, I hope for their sake that, at least in my opinion, I guess it doesn't really matter too much in the grand scheme of things, just one opinion, but I hope for their sake that it improves over time as we get farther into the show, because if this show weren't to be successful, I feel like that would just destroy all of Amazon's film and TV department, because I don't know if you can recover from that kind of financial loss. Although I don't know how it works necessarily with a streaming service, because it's not like people are paying for Lord of the Rings specifically. And some other things that I feel like this show is missing so far that made Lord of the Rings so great is we got a little bit in the beginning with some of the lore that they developed, and this is something I've talked about with what has made House of the Dragon so good so far, is that in this case, they haven't dumped much lore at us. They've given us some names and thrown out a few quips here and there about the different groups of people here, but they haven't really given us much information. We've just been watching characters interact and do things that aren't necessarily the most exciting at times. And so in a way, outside of some really cool and unique landscapes occasionally, it feels like we haven't really felt like we are in Middle-earth, where there's Middle-earth dialogue and Middle-earth attitudes. It almost just feels like they took people from the real world and put them in Middle-earth, and they're just interacting right now. To a degree, obviously, in the case of something like dwarves or something like that, just from their appearance, you obviously recognize, oh, those are Middle-earth characters right there, but at times it just hasn't felt particularly transportive in that sense. And so, again, really hope things kind of pick up a bit, or maybe some of my issues get resolved as I get further into the show and I look at it from a different light. But at the moment, I do love certain aspects. Obviously, the technical side I've mentioned a bunch, but there is also a lot that worries me. And so I don't feel like I have too much else I want to add at the moment, but definitely let me know how you feel about the show so far. If any of you have loved it or feel differently about some of the issues I shared, I would love to hear your thoughts. Maybe it could change my attitude and outlook, because as I've mentioned, my expectations are astronomically high, and so that could definitely be playing into some of my opinions about the show. Whereas if I went into this thinking it's just a new property, a new IP, I may feel differently about some of the aspects. So those were my initial thoughts on the show up to this point. Again, looking forward to hearing how you all are feeling about the show as well. But until the next video, look forward to seeing you all next time. Peace.